Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Soul Focused Radio. This is your host, Martin Friedman. As I said last week, I'm flying solo for a little bit here until we get everything set up with our new lineup here at Soul Focused Radio, which we're very excited about. We have a lot of great podcast episodes coming up for you all. Today is another somber podcast. We're continuing, I'll say somber, but hopeful. We are continuing to discuss the death of Tyre Nichols. And after last week's episode, where Kristen and Anwar and myself explored some of the dynamics and some of the way the reactions have happened, we felt that there's a need to go deeper, specifically with Anwar, on the psychology of the police and how their trauma, their unhealed trauma, is such an essential element of these cycles of killings happening, and these cycles of violence happening, that externalized violence is coming from unhealed internal trauma. And at Soul Focus Group, we're always looking at an inside-out approach. We don't want to just look externally at systems and institutions, but we want very much to see how that external change can come through internal change. And while I say it's a pretty intense episode, and it is still somber, and also we end on a high note with some practical solutions from the police perspective. So we are excited to present this to you. As always, we're so glad you're here listening with us. I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to turn it over to Dustin and Anwar for a deeper conversation about the healing from trauma that's needed for police.
So have you ever heard of a term called groundwater? Groundwater is another word we use at the Soul Focus Group that means subconscious programming. From the ages of 0 to 7, we are subconsciously programmed. So much information and choices and decisions are downloaded into our subconscious mind, and we begin to start living that life. And even though that life we're living is not the life we chose for ourselves, and it's not until we understand the impact of the groundwater, what the groundwater really is, that we begin to wake up to our own lives and begin to choose what we want for ourselves. At the Soul Focus Group, we bring you to that consciousness so that you can begin to choose the life you want to live for yourself.
Hey everybody, this is Dustin. Getting the opportunity to host Soul Focus Group podcast this week. And I'm super amped up, to be honest, to have this conversation with Brother Anwar, who is a former police officer, which you heard on our previous podcast, in South Bend, Indiana. And we've been spending a lot of time processing the murder of Tyre Nichols and using the conversation around Tyre Nichols to look at the epidemic of violence that exists between law enforcement and community, specifically communities of color, and even more specifically, the Black and Latino community. In this conversation, we're going to continue to take a deeper dive into the transformation of trauma and really look into the psychology of law enforcement and what is happening psychologically, spiritually, and emotionally that leads to these painful disconnects we see all too often that end up with someone dying, police officers losing their job, and communities in the nation in a state of trauma. And so, Anwar, just a reminder for everyone, maybe somebody's coming on didn't hear the last podcast. So you were a police officer for 10 years in South Bend, Indiana. Maybe a lot of people don't know about South Bend, Indiana, but what were the social dynamics like in South Bend? Was there a lot of crime? Was there a lot of poverty? Was there a lot of violence? What was it like being a police officer in South Bend, Indiana?
Yeah, Dustin. So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to some listeners, depending on where you're listening to as well or from. So 10 years total, just under 10 years total. Some at a university level, some in South Bend, Indiana, and then the rest of that time in Westfield, Indiana. And I've touched on some of those differences between all of those places. But South Bend, speaking in regards to South Bend and the type of environment that was, it is an urban city. The crime ratio or the crime statistics that it has been compared to per capita to Chicago.
Wow.
It was, it was pretty common that on a yearly basis, we would average around 16 to 20 homicides a year. That was, a city that's about 100,000, a little bit higher than 100,000 in population. So when it came to comparison to other larger cities, it was typically compared to crimes that were common in Chicago per capita. You also had a violent crimes of like stabbings, domestic violence. So yeah, I would say that's what one can compare it to. I know that the crime statistics or the homicide rates fluctuate, but they really have not dropped that much throughout the time that I was there. And then after I've left, I try to keep up and I try to pay attention. And, that is my hometown, I like to call it. And it's been pretty similar since I've left. It has not dropped.
So you laid out the homicide rate, but I know because of progress in the healthcare field, a lot of people are getting shot but not dying. So you said 16 to 20 homicides, but were there a lot of shootings that didn't lead to death?
Oh, no, absolutely. When I was there was some new technology that was installed in the city, and it was called the hotspot or shot spotter. That's what it was called, shot spotter. And essentially, it would triangulate the sound of shots, and it would give us a location of where those shots were coming from. And it's crazy to say, but when that was installed, I feel like the usage of weapons and the usage of guns in the city raised. I think it was because people knew about it and they wanted to test if it was true, that if it could function. And so we were responding to shots I would say almost on a daily basis. Statistically, I can't recall the numbers of shootings that we responded to, but it was pretty large. Typical response for us, or typical calls that we would often give, were domestic violence, shootings, fights, bar fights, robberies, burglaries. So you're thinking more of those aggravated assaults. So more of those higher crimes, those felonies as well.
So Anwar, as you talk about that, and I'm trying to imagine in my mind you as I know you, many of our listeners don't know you, but I know you to be this incredibly gentle, loving, fun, just beautiful human being. I love you to death. I love you from the moment I met you. To be honest, my vision of what a police officer was when I first met you in the workshop we were doing in Fishers, Indiana, I didn't think you were a police officer. You didn't have that affect at all. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to imagine you, as I know you, in these violent situations, because the average person, most of us, we pay our taxes and police officers are hired and we see this stuff on the news. But most of us, by and large, don't experience violence on a regular basis. Again, depending on where we live, we could live in certain communities and experience violence all the time. Right. But most of us don't have a concept of what it means to be a human being like yourself, tasked with going to respond to these acts of violence. So I want to ask, not so much for you to share war stories, but I want our listeners to understand, in detail, some of the things that you saw. Like, I know you shared a story of a young girl, but I want them to know the weight of what you saw on a day-to-day basis in specifics.
Yeah, no, we have to be able to lay it out in context and through the full lens of my life as well, right? So I experienced violence and trauma at a very young age. I grew up, for a large part of my life, I grew up in Mexico in the border town. And as some listeners may or may not know, border towns are typically known for large crimes. And you talk about drug cartels starting in those areas. So that's what I grew up experiencing. Shots being fired, my house at some point, I want to say, it had been burglarized. Let's put it this way. We had 4 or 5 different locks on our door. Coming into our door, you had to use 4 or 5 different keys to be able to get into the house. Wow. That's how many times our house was burglarized. So, coming here to the United States, again, when you think about at a young age, you hear, we're going to move to the United States. I'm thinking, better opportunities. And there were better opportunities. I never once quite imagined that the area that I would live in would be also riddled with drugs, would be riddled with violence as well. So part of that is what called me to go into policing and wanting to go back to work in a town that I first laid my feet on. So then, imagine wanting to go in with that drive, wanting to go in eager to want to work on helping and changing the community. And right off the bat, it was pretty alarming and pretty eye-opening to the things that I was experiencing. You talked about the weight of it. It felt so heavy at times that, even when I took off my physical vest and even when I took off the belt that I wore, averaging weight of 10 to 15 pounds.
Your gun and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. All of the equipment that I carried, it felt like I was still carrying probably after I got off of work at times, more often than not, I was carrying, a 100-pound sandbag on my back. Your shoulders get tense. So not only do you experience that emotional toll, but physically, you look at, there should be research. You know how they have those pictures of presidents when they first get sworn in, and then 4 years later, and you see a physical change.
Yeah, they aged 20 years within 8 years.
Yeah, I would not be surprised that you have that in law enforcement as well. And a lot of it is because of the cause that you're going into. You go into, again, some pretty horrific homicides. You go into some pretty horrific child abuse. Your humanity, I would say, gets ripped away pretty quickly to be able to deal with this stuff. Yeah. You experience that shock. You experience that transitional phase of, okay, I'm here as a human being putting all this stuff on, but when it comes to answering to these calls, I have to leave that to the side to be able to go through a lot of this stuff, to be able to deal with it in a way that I'm thinking is functioning, but it's really not functioning. You have to be able to turn on the survival remote or survival mode on, and then the other part of you, the true living part of you, gets shut off.
Right. And so, Anwar, I remember you telling me stories, so you talked about going in and seeing children abused, or, the aftermath of a homicide or a really violent domestic call. I remember you talking about going to a car accident on some railroad tracks, and you saw something pretty horrific, right? Mm-hmm. What did you see?
We responded to the train conductor called us and called the police department, and he reported what he believed to hit a person or hit something on the railroads. It was pretty late at night. I want to say 1, 2 in the morning. I can't fully recall, but I know it was at night. It was dark outside. So we're walking the tracks, and as we're walking the tracks, we come across a person that was unhoused, who had just been released from jail in a late winter night, and he laid on the tracks, and his head was severed. He laid his head on the tracks itself, and the train went through. So yeah, that's one of the many things that as a young person, as a young man, you're talking about at the age I was 20, 24, 25 years old.
Yeah.
That was one of many.
Yeah, that's a lot to see. And it's, when we think about trauma and then the impact of trauma, in many ways, being a police officer is no different than being a soldier in a war zone, in terms of the things that you are sent to that most human beings would want to run away from. I know from my experience, many of our listeners don't know, but from the ages of 19 to 22, I was a corrections officer in New Jersey, in a county jail. And, I saw suicides, people cutting their throats, doing a cell check and seeing blood pour under the cell door, or finding people hanging themselves, and, seeing some of the most horrible fights you could ever imagine. Right. And for me, and for all the folks that were on my squad, I worked the 3 to 11 shift. What we did, Anwar, after the shift to deal with this? We went to the bar and we drank. Right. Which was, for me personally, that was an era that really amplified my alcoholism, that really cemented my alcoholism as a way of coping with that trauma. And so, from seeing someone's head severed to the aftermath of a shooting, I know you saw someone getting stabbed on a call you went to right in front of you. That's a lot of trauma. And you came into the job with trauma. And so I guess I want to ask you, how did you cope with this at that time in your journey?
I never really knew about coping mechanisms until later on in my life. Most recently, right, when I started looking more into truly healing from this trauma and being able to process a lot of the emotions and a lot of the things that I feel. At a young age, I was never truly taught to love. I was not taught to be patient. I was not taught to really be able to deal with my emotions. So I can't quite say that I cope with it. I think if anything, I suppressed it. I just, brushed it off and kept moving and thinking, okay, it's not really affecting me, but I never quite really asked myself, how is it affecting me inside as I'm holding on to it? It's almost like, you're playing that game of hot potato. You're going from hot call to hot call without ever releasing the potato, not realizing that it's burning you.
Yeah.
And that's what was happening. You look down and you're physically being damaged. And there are times that you get hurt on the job, physical, but I would say there's more of emotional and mental damage than what is truly being reported. You look at the amount of some suicides in law enforcement. You look at the amount of the divorce rate. You look at the substance use disorder in police officers. I mean, it's staggering.
Mm-hmm.
The suicide rate is in the top 10, I believe.
Right.
When it comes to professions in the United States, and you're talking about a profession that is essential, that is needed.
Critical.
Yet it's critical. Yet we're not essentially providing officers with the means and the ways to truly get this work done. So there's just so much that is in there. There's just so much that officers are institutionalized to believe that, this type of stuff doesn't exist, that, the alpha mindset, that the toxic male mindset that we've talked about in the past. I mean, it is in the core of this type of career.
Right. And Anwar, as you say that, the lack of services to support a human being going through those experiences, my contention has always been, law enforcement, policing is used as a political football from the left and the right. But the truth is, I don't care if you go to a blue state or a red state, there's no support for police officers. Police officers essentially are sent to go take care of the stuff that nobody else wants to go deal with. Right. And then they give them a pension and, they die early death. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But before, and I want to go deeper into that thought, but before we do that, Anwar, if you had to say one word, 2 words, maybe 3, that defined what your mental state, your emotional state was during that time before you, developed an understanding of what it means to heal trauma, and what did your body feel like?
So I would say my mental state was probably at a place of truly, I want to say the word lost. And I think, wanting to go deeper with it, I truly believe I was at a place of cognitive dissonance a lot of times.
Say what that means.
So, it's when internally, inside of you, that, ethically what is right, what you feel is truly the best decision. But when it comes to the external, when it comes to making that decision, you're doing the opposite of that. So it's not really going with your true gut and true belief is. You're moving away from that to be able to do something else, to be able to go with something else. So like that idea, when people are asked, there's a good cognitive dissonance test if anybody wants to do it. They're out there online for those that don't believe in cognitive dissonance. But one example could be, we can sit here and say that texting and driving is a highly dangerous thing to do. Yet we do it ourselves, right? We can sit here and debate, or we can sit here and say that is not correct, that is not safe for people to be driving on the road and texting at the same time. Yet when we get in the vehicle, at times we use it ourselves. So that is one of the ideas of cognitive dissonance. And that's where I say, a lot of times I function from, looking at policing through the lens of social justice. Was I fully always applying that? Was I always standing up for that? No.
Right.
No. When it came to the preservation of the way that I was with other officers, of the brotherhood, of making sure that I kept that's when, it was to the side. I put social justice to the side to be able to be a part of that.
Right.
Because I quickly saw how officers that were standing up for those things, they were, tarnished. They were pushed to the side. They were, pushed out of police departments. And we see this often. So, I would say my mental state was there. It was lost. And I would say my physical being or my physical feelings were numb. I was numb.
Numb.
Yeah.
So being numb, being in a state of cognitive dissonance, holding the trauma you had as a child, and then the reoccurring trauma you experienced as a police officer. I know you had a family, you had a wife, you had a mother, you had sisters, brothers. How did that affect your relationship with your most intimate loved ones?
I think it affected those pieces in numerous ways. When you're intimate with someone, you're able to trust, right? You're able to be truthful. You're able to show your most vulnerable sides. And throughout the time that I was in policing, I didn't have that. I didn't feel safe to do those things. So I think it affected my intimate relationships tremendously with my own family members. I kept a lot of stuff from them often. I thought I was doing it in a way of protection. So it was rare that even the stuff that has really traumatized me the most, I've been able to keep to myself.
Right.
So yeah, I would say I had a lack of intimacy with my loved ones. I had a lack of trust, and I had a lack of feeling safe. Part of this job, it turns you into this very cold person to be able to survive in it. And I was functioning in my relationships at no fault of their own, but at my fault. I was functioning from that place of being cold, from that place of being really frozen.
Right.
So when it came to being empathetic with my loved ones, when it came to being able to see their humanity, I couldn't.
And I really hope our listeners can feel what you were saying right now, Anwar, because the numbness, the being shut down, the not feeling safe, the experiencing of intense violent trauma, the carrying of multi-generational trauma, all you holding all that, and simultaneously, and I want y'all to hear this, and I mean this with all my heart, Anwar is a beautiful, beautiful human being, right? That's a lot to hold. And so I think about Anwar, for our listeners, Anwar and myself and Brother Albert were doing a week-long series of workshops with the Carmel, Indiana Police Department. And we ended up doing this exercise of looking at our socialization and the boxes we end up holding, right? And so we took these officers through an experience. When we were out there doing this, there had been a mass shooting in Indiana. And I woke up that morning and saw it on the news. And the first thing I thought about, well, of course, was the family members and the community members that had to live with this. But then I just wondered, what would it be like to be the first responder on a scene of just such mass carnage? That must be breathtaking. Mm-hmm. And then, so you think about that officer, then you think about everything you talked about, Anwar, in terms of growing up with trauma and thinking about young people or people in community who are experiencing trauma, right, but don't have any resources to deal with it. And they're seeing violence on a day-to-day basis as young people. I think about this. There was this 14-year-old kid that once came to a workshop in Indianapolis, and he talked about 13-year-old kid who saw his best friend's brains blown out right next to him, right? So you think about all that trauma, that cognitive dissonance that young person experiences with no language and all that numbness. So he has his box of trauma, the police officer has their box of trauma. Then they get called to, the officer gets a call to some young people cutting up at the mall, being teenagers, but maybe a little extra. Those two boxes come together, Anwar. What is bound to happen?
You're creating a recipe for a traumatic incident itself. You're creating an incident that where humanity is going to be ignored. You're creating an incident where truly both of those, both of whoever's coming to that interaction, they're going to fail to see one another. If anything, they're going to revert to their trauma, right? They're going to be able to pull inside and go inside to those really dark places. And externally, those outcomes are going to show up, or externally, those things are going to be created. Especially, again, if you are one that really hasn't healed that trauma, if you're one that has not worked through that process of healing itself, it pops up, and we see it. I mean, we're seeing it with the death of Tyre Nichols. We see it in the interactions, and we see it in incidents of one of the videos that we've used in the past was a violent interaction with a 6 or 9 year old Black female with 6-7 police officers. Like that type of stuff is what's happening, and that's just one out of many. Because I'm telling you, if we had more cameras in the United States, if we had more poll cameras, we would be seeing it more frequently, I believe.
No, I believe
you see it with police officers in schools, right? Those are our children that are there to be protected. And again, this is not a question of intentions. This is more of a question of what the trauma that they're working, or the trauma that it currently exists for someone, and the impact of the trauma once it's imposed on someone else. That's what this comes down to.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
When you come to the Soul Focus Group, you come to an acknowledgement that there has been injuries done to us from all these different forms of oppression. Injuries that have impacted our subconscious mind, our heart, our spirit, our very soul. So at the Soul Focus Group, we recognize that and we focus on healing. Healing, the return or the recovery of our connections to our healthy self, our beautiful thinking mind. We want you to come join us in a movement of healing all around the world to restore us back to our rightful state. At the Soul Focus Group, we heal.
And, Anwar, we have these conversations around this, and it's just like Groundhog's Day. We keep having the same conversations, expecting different results, but we're not getting to the live wire. And so, just even thinking about the fact of you going to that severed head on the railroad, I imagine you could have been sent to the silliest, most annoying of calls of maybe someone arguing over a parking spot, right? Mm-hmm. There is no, how do we expect people to transition from something so ugly to something so pedestrian and maintain their humanity? It's like, that should be malpractice. We're setting up this scenario to happen. And in many ways, it's a setup because neither forces are fundamentally valid. I mean, whether it's law enforcement, which are predominantly working class white men, predominantly working class men, now more and more women, predominantly, and then poor communities. Our society in our collective groundwater, we don't value working class people. We don't value poor people. We don't value people of color, right? And so there's no value of these two separate entities, if you will, even though they're not really separate because community can become police officers part of community, right? But to allow folks to transition from such a highly charged experience into any other thing without any cleansing is saying, well, put us on the news, put our police department on the news, because or it's just a rampant misunderstanding of human psychology.
And as you talk about value and as you talk about the way that a lot of these historically marginalized and historically excluded communities, you bring up an excellent point about psychology. In the time that I was a police officer, we had little to none working knowledge of psychology, of how brains function, of how teenagers function, of how adults suffering from substance use disorder function. Like, we didn't have any of that. So if anything, we continue to work with these communities from that place of invaluable. Mm-hmm. It would be foolish to sit here and say that when we don't find value in something or someone, that we're going to treat it with that high regard. Right. If we're not even willing to do that with material stuff, why would we do it with human beings?
Right. I
was just recently I had the opportunity here at the high school that I work at to be part of this amazing, advanced placement class presentation. It's an AP research class, and, students get to research whatever topic they want. And, I was wanting to be a part of that by being just a listener, an audience, a person in the audience. This is an amazing young woman by the name of Chandler went on there and gave her presentation. Amazing. She wanted to talk about school resource officers in schools, and are they needed? What is their impact of school resource officers and stuff like that? And this has been a debate, as we know. This has been a debate not only locally, but nationally as well. Well, by the end, she talked about school resource officer training. You're talking about, I can't fully recall, but I want to say it was 40 or 80 hours. And in those 40 or 80 hours, this is what I got to learn. The school resource officers were chosen mainly in these three areas or in these three ways. They were either placed on there out of punishment. Older police officers were placed in the schools just to be able to retire. Or it was new police officers that had just gotten on board and they were not yet ready to go into the road, so they were put in the schools with little to no training. When it comes to trauma training or de-escalation training, little to no training. So think about that. You talk about age groups that are highly volatile, that are highly emotional, that are highly egotistical, yet the psychological training or the psychology training is non-existent.
So then what is that saying then? What is that saying around the value of a healthy relationship between an officer and students?
It's really not being taken with regard. It's non-existent. I still can't quite. And I actually told this young girl, during the AP presentation, I'm like, it's not crazy, but it's the reality. I had more training on self-defense tactics, on knowing how to fight and knowing how to defend myself and knowing how to pull the trigger than knowing how to de-escalate a situation. Mm-hmm. So which one is our brain going to pull us to automatically? Right. Our subconscious, right? Our subconscious is functioning 95 to 98% of the times, as we know. So we are going to go there. That is what I was getting the most. So then why are we surprised, or why do we want to act surprised when police officers are going to that violent place?
Yeah, exactly. So you were programmed into combat, not into service.
Absolutely. There's a great documentary. I can't remember if it was on Netflix, but there's a great documentary where a sheriff of a town talks about the creation of the SWAT team in his town, in the town that he worked for. And he says that was the worst thing that he could have developed.
Why so?
Because of the violence that was being brought into the city. Mm-hmm. You look at I believe it was called the Scorpion Unit, with this incident with
Memphis.
Yeah, with Tyree Nichols. Those are highly violent units. Right. You look at the guys that they pick for those units. They match in physical appearance. They match in stature. They match in size. They're not going there to de-escalate a situation. Let's just be honest. They're not.
Right.
They're going in there to take care of business. Early on in South Bend Police, we would often have roundtable conversations or conversations around coffee shops with older police officers. And I still recall a conversation that we had with an older police officer that was talking about a shirt that was made back in the day with a motto on the shirt. And this is the shirt a t-shirt that they wore underneath their uniform. And the t-shirt said, or the motto was, if you run, you bleed. Mm-hmm. What are you bleeding from? Is it because you fell and you scraped your knee, or what are you really bleeding from? Mm-hmm. They also would tell us about stories that they would drive around in these neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods that I was patrolling were predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods that were experiencing poverty. But they would get on the PA, and again, this was back in the day prior to me working in South Bend Police. They would get in the PA systems of their vehicles and give almost a warning announcement of, you better get in the house. If we catch you after 11 p.m., we're going to take care of you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How so, right?
War zone again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Combat.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's essentially no different than maybe the U.S. Marines were giving, the type of commands they were given in Fallujah. Mm-hmm. It's really no different, right? In a combat zone. As you say all this, Anwar, I really want to ask you this. What is as you come into the job, I know there's some form, like when I was a corrections officer, we had to take a psychological test, but it was a joke, right? We know 95 to 98% of people growing up in the United States in some way, shape, or form have been traumatized. And we know that hurt people hurt people. I guess I want our listeners to understand, how are departments assessing the psychological state of officers even before they get into the job? Is there anything robust that maybe I don't know about?
No. So, when I got hired, you go through, and again, this is depending on the police department. This is depending on what they have in place. But for South Bend Police Department, the way that it worked was, I went in, took a written test, you take a physical test. And the written test, there's some mathematics on there. There's some memorization type of stuff. And then you do the physical test, which again, the physical test is really it's a breeze to pass.
Yeah.
You run in a mile and a half and all that.
Yeah.
Then after that, you go take an interview, you do a polygraph, and then you do a psychological test. But the psychological test I did on my own. I answered my own questions. So how accurately are those answers also? Like, what is the accuracy on the responses that they're getting based on those individuals and the way that they're responding? Because, see, I still remember they had some questions around discrimination. But if I'm sitting here in front of this computer wanting to get a job and it's asking me that I am more likely to look at a person of color in a different way, very likely, most likely, not likely at all.
Yes.
That's right, what I'm saying. So there was, it is not accurate. You're not getting the officers that the way to funnel that or the way to work through that in the way that is currently functioning is not really working. I still recall there was an officer when I worked in South Bend who was afraid of working during the night shift. This officer allegedly tried to, at some point stop his career. He was in training at the time and ended up just not. He said it was not going to work for him, but he still works there now. They kept him on the job.
Right.
You see instances of police officers that get in trouble at one police department and they're able to go work somewhere else.
Get hired somewhere else. Yeah.
So what does that say about the system itself? That's what I'm saying. The way that it's currently functioning, it's highly problematic.
Right. So I often even thought about the age requirements, so like I was 19, running a tier, built for 30 that housed 60 grown men who were facing, people who had killed people. I mean, people were facing serious life stuff. And I'm this 19-year-old kid telling grown men what to do. Right. Mm-hmm. I had no life experience. So I think about a police officer, coming in at 20, 21 years old, going to a domestic violence call. You've never been married before. How are you going to go and tell a 50-year-old husband or wife how they should, relate to each other? Right. And so even though we know even our brains aren't developed until 25, 26 years old, and let alone everything else we've talked about in this conversation. And, Anwar, as I'm listening to the conversation we're having right now, it would be my hope that every police officer in this country could hear what you're talking about. And I think about, for our listeners who don't remember from the last podcast, Anwar is no longer a police officer. He's a school counselor now. But the truth is, because I remember when you left your job, we had many conversations around this, but you're exactly the person that we should have policing our communities, right? But I want our listeners to know why you ended up leaving.
Yeah, so part of why I ended up leaving, right around 2020, after the death of George Floyd, I went through really this awakening process. And part of it was I was tired of similar conversations. I was tired of similar responses by police officers, especially the police officers that I was working with after the death of George Floyd. A lot of times these conversations are ones that they want to justify the action or they want to justify what happened to really save face or to continue to say, it was fine. That person, maybe they should not have resisted or whatever, that type of stuff. But I was sitting here with that case. It was more clear cut. It really was. Mm-hmm. So I could not stand it anymore. I just could not continue to live with that cognitive dissonance. I just could not continue to live through, unfortunately, it was a false sense of self that I had at the time. So I started I continued advocating the way that I did. And I continued to, and actually I found my strength to be able to speak up for things that I was seeing and that I was noticing. In that process, it quickly became apparent that instead of my advocacy being seen through the lens of growth for the police department, it was seen as as an infection for the police department, we'll say. Mm-hmm. And what are you going to do in your physical body? What are you going to do when you have an infection? You want to get rid of it.
Right.
So that's what it was. That's what happened in that process. I just felt that at that point, it was probably safer for my mental health too, to be able to remove myself from that type of environment, to be able to remove myself from that type of workplace. And I did. I ended I didn't even put a 2 weeks notice. I quit on a Wednesday afternoon, left, and at some point the talks were that I could still keep my badge as a thing to remember my service, and I had no connection to it by that point. By that point, it was meaningless to me to keep something like that.
Yeah. And I think it's important for all of us who are listening to this conversation to really reflect on an officer who was getting deeply in touch with their humanity, was forced to leave a profession that could not hold the expansive nature of him expressing humanity and wanting the police department to get better. Because I know what Anwar was experiencing directly. Like I said, because we talked about this a lot, he wasn't trying to just jam people up. That's not his approach at all. But he was saying we can do better. And they just didn't have the capacity to hear this. And so, Anwar, as we begin to wrap this conversation up, I think about there's been almost a cycle of how we approach issues like Tyree Nichols. So people will, this will happen. A lot of folks will get upset, rightfully so. A lot of people will get hurt, rightfully so. There will be protests and demands. Some actions will be taken around the edges, but nothing really seeps into the groundwater of law enforcement as a collective institution, let alone the individual groundwater. And when we say groundwater, again, we're saying the subconscious programming that holds all this stuff in place. This is where the trauma from the job, the trauma before the job, racism, toxic masculinity, all that stuff sits within us. And so I want to take an opportunity for us to end with some potential solutions. And so the first question, I want to start with the individual solution and then a collective solution. So I want you to imagine you now as a training officer, and you don't just get 3 or 6 months with an officer. Let's say you have a young man who you're going to mentor for 2 years as a police officer. How would you mentor them to be a more effective guardian of the community?
You spend a lot of time with those who you're training in the vehicle, right? I mean, a lot of time. So one of the things that officers should look at, or if I were training somebody, I would want to look at how is it that I'm spending this time after we go and experience something traumatic in the call. That you could always take a little bit of time to just park and have a conversation, debrief about what you just experienced and what you just observed. And in my experience, I rarely had that. I almost want to say I never really had that to begin with. So I would want to think about that. I would want to think about how is it that I'm creating this intimate connection. And when we say intimate, we're not just talking about romantic. We're talking about truly being able to be vulnerable with someone else to a level that you're creating trust, that you're creating that level of respect, and that you're actually able to see that person's humanity. It really, that place of intimacy really takes you to fully want to know who you're working with through that lens of accountability as well, right?
Right.
But yeah, I would want to do some of that work, want to get to know the person, want to get to know their trauma. And again, you almost want to act as if you are a counselor inside of the vehicle as you're training that other officer. Another thing that I think would be highly beneficial would be for officers to be able to trust one another, that if you're going to hold someone accountable, that you can also hold their mental health accountable. And often that was not happening.
Right.
It was more like calling each other out because you made that scene feel unsafe because of your officer tactics. But what about your mental health? How am I taking care of your mental health? And how am I also working with you to take care of your mental health so that it's safe as well? And that was, again, in my experience, that was truly invisible. That was truly not there. That mental health piece was pushed to the side. But the last thing is truly being able to work with that patrol officer or working with that new officer to work on that level of what we continue to talk about, self-solidarity. You come into work today, right? Let's say you had a spousal problem and you're supposed to be driving the vehicle today. You know what? Let me take care of it. Let me drive today. So then I know that our mind is at a different place instead of coming in and bringing that stuff in. And while I'm driving, why don't we talk through this stuff before we show up at a domestic violence call and whatever groundwater you have shows up before that stuff shows up. And now we're making wrong decisions here.
Yeah. So much of what I hear you say, at least in relationship, training that young officer in terms of their interactions with the community, is helping to see themselves in the people that they serve.
Absolutely.
Holistically, right? Not just, around racial identities and things like that, but that we are human beings. Like, so you talked about the officer having a domestic violence, not domestic violence, but maybe a fight with their wife or husband, right? Mm-hmm. So when they go into a call, they can relate to that situation instead of being robotic, warriors. They can begin to maybe see themselves as holistic guardians of the community.
Absolutely.
Not to put words in your mouth, but that's kind of what I heard.
No, that is it, right? It is that level of seeing and feeling each other, but it also those who you're working with, that community that you're working with. Instead of that community that you're working for, is that community that you're working with alongside.
Right.
And I'm seeing it in different levels. I'm also seeing it through the level of education. I often see that teachers or staff members here at the school are not able to fully holistically see the individual student. And that impact of you having those glasses that are not allowing you to fully see someone else is tremendous. It can truly have a negative impact that we may not see now or we may not see tomorrow, but we may see that long term.
You know what, Anwar? One of the things that I've seen you do consistently is really have young people who a lot of people in our world might be afraid of. I see you bring them to our workshops. I see you developing really healthy, vulnerable relationships with them. And so I imagine, how different would it be if a police officer, and I know the job is set up where they're going from call to call, and then there becomes this us versus them mentality, on both sides, right? But if the officer holding the power in those situations, the power of the law, the state behind them, having a gun, having, other police officers who would come to their aid, what would happen if officers, not only what would happen, but how should it happen for officers to really take time to know people in the community? Because I know, right, as a coach, right, I know even as a corrections officer, when you build relationship with people, they're going to be hard pressed to do some stuff they know they shouldn't be doing in relationship to you.
As I'm sitting here thinking about Tyree Nichols, I'm thinking of when you just asked this question, is what would the outcome be? And would it be a different outcome if those officers were seeing their own son in that incident? Right. I think that if we're able to let go of this idea of power in the sense of power over, we would have more bonding relationships and broken relationships. If we're truly able to see ourselves as empowered individuals when it comes to dealing with people and when it comes to dealing with human beings and when it comes to dealing with those who we are there to work with, the outcome would also be an empowering one. I continue to think about how disempowered our communities are, but then also how disempowered our police officers are.
That's an interesting lens. Most people don't see that. Please speak about that.
Well, you think about, for example, again, me dealing with trauma as a young adult, me dealing with trauma as a young child. If I would have continued that route and not gone into policing, how would it have been if a police officer would have dealt with me with the disempowered self of myself, right?
Right.
But also, what would be the outcome if that police officer came in with empowering messages, with empowerment itself?
Right.
I can guarantee you it would have pulled me up from where I was. That's how it worked when I was in education for me. I was a highly disempowered student.
Right.
I really was.
Right.
Until I met those who were empowered enough to empower me. And now you see the trajectory that I'm going toward.
Right. Right. Anwar, as you say that, I worked at a bowling alley growing up, and there was some off-duty Willingboro police officers, a hometown I grew up with in New Jersey. And there was one officer, John Sweeney, who was, again, one of the best people I've ever known. And we would talk, like if I had a 4-hour shift, we would talk 3.5 hours of the shift about everything. But that relationship with him fundamentally changed my whole idea of who police were. And it helped me to see an older man who was a police officer, older white man, Irish police officer, New Jersey Irish police officer, who cared about me as a human being. And it caused me to reflect on something, because, I was wild. I mean, I was not completely wild now, but I was driving drunk, getting high all the time. He didn't know that about me, but I saw someone in that type of position who really cared about me, right? Really cared about me. I mean, he would bring me food in. I mean, we had a relationship, right? And so I imagine if those relationships were established throughout community, that would change so much. And so, Anwar, I want to this is our very last question. And I want to close with this question. I want you to share what should be done to mature the relationship around trauma for law enforcement as themselves, as well as their interactions with community on a systemic level. What are some specific solutions that should be embedded maybe in the hiring practice, in the academy, and along the way as their officers that could address trauma and the toxic groundwater, the toxic masculinity, so officers can show up as their best selves?
Absolutely. I continue to think about the level of institutionalization that happens in the field itself. I would say that one of the things that needs to happen, or that could benefit the police departments, would be to move away from this militaristic ideas, from continuing to see police officers as an army instead of seeing police officers as individuals themselves, seeing police officers' humanities and those who you're hiring, really getting to know and creating strong bonds with those officers. What are the types of conversations that are happening in police departments as well? The types of training. I would I would love to see more de-escalation training. You are able to do de-escalation training along with or as well as self-defense tactics. I'm not saying move away completely from self-defense training or shooting, but you can also introduce, verbal judo, right? Or you can also introduce more de-escalation training. I also would love to see more mental health supports within policing. Are there counselors on site that can help officers debrief situations? Not as a group, but as individuals. Because I've often seen it where it's like, you bring 10 officers in and we want to talk about a conversation that really doesn't allow for vulnerability, especially if you don't trust those officers or there's not a good bond between those police officers. So do we have that? Do we have more of that social worker role within policing? And again, I'm not saying move away completely from also the level of protection that we may need at times, because that is our reality, that at times we will need, that guns being utilized in policing. That's just the reality. But do we need to go to that automatically before you may be using some de-escalation techniques? I was able to become a better police officer once I became a hostage negotiator. And a lot of it was because I received more de-escalation training. But also, what type of work are these police officers getting when it comes to their identity, their self-identity? You talked about what is being provided, or, my question is, what type of conversations are these officers having internally? Is it a mature conversation? Is it an intimate conversation with yourself, or is it an immature one?
Right.
So yeah, those are some things that I can think of right off the bat. What other relationships? What other ways are police officers getting involved within the community? What type of connections do they have with the schools? Not only as school resource officers, but are they involved in the schools in means to show schools, the career of policing, a healthy career of policing? Are they in classrooms with the youth so they can hear what the youth believes about policing? Are we listening? Are police departments having community members come in and community members being heard about what they believe they may need?
So really establishing two-way accountability and learning to listen and listen from zero.
Mm-hmm.
Those are beautiful ideas, Anwar. And I really, really want to thank you so much for joining us today for this podcast. I'm super proud that you're a part of our training team, part of the Soul Focus Group family. And for those who are listening, I hope some of you who have relationships with law enforcement could potentially see the value of bringing Anwar in from his experience as an officer to consult and work directly with your police department or with your community around what we call healing the breach. And we develop a very specific process that is designed to bring community and law enforcement together to really process the weight of trauma, toxic socialization, toxic subconscious programming, all in the spirit of healing a relationship. It's not something that's done, in front of the news cameras. It's not, an Instagram clip. It's some work of depth and real relationship building where we're not pointing the finger at each other, but we're all creating a space where there's a commitment to collective healing. And if you're interested in knowing more about healing the breach process, please reach out to us at soulfocusgroup.com. But Anwar, I just want to say, brother, as you know, I love you dearly. You're family to me. And I just thank you for sharing your wisdom.
Oh, thank you all again for having me on again. And again, just continue to encourage all the listeners to truly think about their self-solidarity work and what that may look like. And question yourself, how am I seeing other people? Am I seeing other human beings? And am I seeing maybe my students? Am I seeing clients? Am I seeing just anyone that I come across? Am I seeing them through my groundwater, or am I seeing them through my conscious self? Am I seeing them through that lens of humanity? But again, thank you all. This has been phenomenal. And I look forward to future conversations.
Yes, sir. Peace, everybody. Thank you for listening.
My genius, my power, my optimal functioning. My genius, my power, my optimal functioning. Repeat after me. My genius, my power, my optimal functioning. That is the jingle of the Soul Focus Group, because we are dedicated to helping you recover your genius, your power, and your optimal functioning. We want you to recognize the unique way that you comprehend things, express yourself, experience, and create in the world. We want to help you recover your genius, your power, your optimal functioning.
That conversation for me was revelatory. It was an extremely powerful conversation. You know, one of the things that I love about Dustin is Dustin loves to drill down. And I think it's so needed. We think it's so needed right now to drill down and to not just have this conversation on the surface all the time. And oftentimes we get stuck in this either or, us against them. And at Soul Focus Group, everything that we do is about getting past that, getting through that to the other side, which is human solidarity, self-solidarity and human solidarity. And I thought that the conversation between Dustin and Anwar was such a great example of that. So I know it's heavy. As I said in the intro, we did end with some possible tangible solutions that aren't expensive. They're not crazy to think about. They're not wild to think about. These are things that we can actually do. So we thank you so much for listening to this episode. We thank you for being part of the Soul Focused family. Know that we love you and care about you. And we strongly believe that together we are going to be able to solve these problems. We have to see all of these as solvable problems. And we do at the Soul Focused Group. Please come to our website, soulfocusedgroup.com. Subscribe, like all of our podcasts on all the platforms. Please share with people and help us grow. We really believe that as we grow, we are going to help to heal this world. You're going to help. All of us together are going to help to heal this world, which is in desperate need of healing. So the last thing, as always, is that we ask you to stay safe, stay well, and most of all, stay soul focused.